The November wind cut across the pasture like it had personal business with my face. But the Holsteins didn't care about my comfort. They shuffled into the milking parlor same as always, their breath steaming in the pre-dawn dark, udders swollen and needing relief. I'd been doing this since I was 12 years old, following my grandfather through these same motions, and there was something honest about work that didn't change just because you wanted it to. The mechanical rhythm of the milking machines, the sweet sour smell of silage, the way old Bessie always tried to step on my foot in the third stall. These things were constants in a world that seemed increasingly uncertain everywhere else. Rachel had the coffee going when I came in at 7:30. My boots left on the porch because she'd made that rule 15 years ago when we got married, and I'd learned which battles mattered. The kitchen was warm, filled with morning light that made everything look softer than it actually was. She was packing Emma's lunch, moving through the routine with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. "Vernon's place today?" she asked, not looking up from the sandwich she was making. "Yeah, figured I'd head up after breakfast, get the pipes drained before the real cold sets in." I poured coffee into the thermos she'd already set out for me. "Be back Friday night, Saturday morning latest." She looked at me then, and I saw the concern she was trying to keep casual. "You sure you don't want company? Emma's got that field trip Friday, but I could come up Thursday night." "It's just winterizing, Rach. Drain some pipes, seal some windows, make sure the roof's not leaking. I'll be bored out of my mind." I kissed her forehead, tasting the faint coconut of whatever shampoo she used. "Besides, someone needs to handle the morning milking here." "Dale's son could do it. He's been asking for work." "And pay him what?" "We're barely clearing enough as it is." The words came out sharper than I meant them, and I saw her shoulders tense. Money had been tight since milk prices dropped. Tighter still since we'd had to replace the cooling system in August. "Sorry, it's one less expense if I do it myself." Emma came thundering down the stairs then, backpack bouncing against her shoulders. And the conversation ended the way conversations do when you've got a 10-year-old who doesn't understand why adults need silence sometimes. She chattered about her friend Madison's birthday party while she ate cereal, and I made the appropriate sounds of interest while my mind was already 40 miles north, thinking about the work waiting for me. The drive up to Spider Lake took me through Hayward and then beyond, past the last gas station that sold anything besides bait and beer, onto county roads that got narrower and rougher, until the final 2-track that led to Vernon's cabin felt more like a suggestion than an actual road. The pines crowded close on both sides, their branches forming a tunnel that blocked out most of the afternoon sun. I'd made this drive dozens of times over the years, usually during summer when Vernon was alive, and would invite me up for fishing, and the kind of quiet male companionship that didn't require much talking. The cabin appeared where it always did, a small structure that looked more like an idea of shelter than actual comfort. 2 rooms, a wood stove, an outhouse out back that I dreaded using even in summer. But it sat on 12 acres of prime lakefront, and the realtor I'd talked to said that alone made it worth $60,000, maybe $70,000 if I waited for the right buyer. Vernon had died without kids, without even a wife anymore after Aunt Linda passed in '94, and somehow I'd ended up as the inheritor of this piece of solitude that felt both like a gift and a burden. I pulled up to the cabin just as the sun was starting its descent toward the tree line. November dusk came early this far north, and I wanted to get the truck unloaded and a fire started before full dark. The silence hit me when I killed the engine. Not the peaceful quiet of isolation, but something deeper, something absent. I stood there by the truck door, grocery bags in hand, trying to identify what felt wrong. No birds. That was it. Usually you'd hear ravens calling to each other, or the chickadees that lived in the pines year-round, or at minimum the whisper of wind through the trees. But there was nothing. Just a stillness that felt like the forest was holding its breath. I told myself it was just the season, that birds migrated, and November was the dead time before winter truly settled in. I'd been around woods my entire life, grew up hunting these forests with my father and grandfather, spent countless nights camping under these same stars. There was nothing in Wisconsin wilderness that I needed to fear. We didn't have grizzlies or mountain lions, and even the wolf packs that had returned in recent years were more afraid of humans than we were of them. But as I carried my supplies inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the tree line. I turned twice, scanning the darkening woods, seeing nothing but the geometric shadows of pine trunks and the first scattered stars appearing in the gaps between branches. My hands were steady as I unlocked the cabin door, as I'd expected them to be. I was a practical man, not given to flights of imagination. Whatever unease I felt, I attributed to being alone, to the isolation that Rachel always said made me broody. The cabin interior smelled like old wood and mouse droppings, and the ghost of Vernon's pipe tobacco, which somehow still lingered 3 years after his death. I got the wood stove going with kindling I'd brought from home, coaxed flame into being, and felt better once warmth started spreading through the small space. The work ahead was simple and straightforward. Drain the pipes so they wouldn't freeze and burst, check the roof for leaks, seal any windows where cold air was getting through. Tomorrow I'd tackle the plumbing. Tonight I'd just get settled and maybe walk down to the lake before full dark. I was opening a can of chili for dinner when I heard them, the loons on Spider Lake. I'd been hearing loons my entire life. Their tremolo calls were as much a part of northern Wisconsin as pine trees and snow. But these sounds were wrong. Instead of their usual wail or the yodel call males make during breeding season, these were screams. High-pitched, almost human screams that cut across the water and then stopped abruptly, like someone had thrown a switch. The hair on my arms stood up despite the warmth from the stove. I moved to the window, looking out at the lake, where the last light was dying on the water's surface. Nothing moved. The screaming didn't resume. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, oppressive in a way that made me want to get back in the truck and drive home to Rachel and Emma and the predictable comfort of our dairy farm, where the only sounds at night were cows settling in the barn and the occasional coyote singing in the back 40. Instead, I ate my chili, standing at the counter, telling myself that loons made all kinds of sounds, that I probably just wasn't remembering them correctly, that 34 years of Wisconsin living didn't make me an expert on every possible bird call. But I didn't take that walk down to the lake. I kept the fire burning hotter than necessary, and when I finally stretched out on Vernon's old cot with my clothes still on, I left the flashlight within arm's reach and found myself listening to the silence, waiting for it to break. Sleep came eventually, but it was shallow and troubled, filled with half-formed dreams of things moving just beyond the range of vision. I woke sometime deep in the night to absolute darkness. The fire had died to embers and lay there feeling my heart hammering against my ribs for no reason I could name. The silence was complete. No insects, no night birds, not even the creak of trees settling in the cold. It was as if every living thing in the forest had decided to hold perfectly still, waiting for something to pass by. I thought about Rachel asking if I wanted company, about how I'd dismissed her concern with practical talk of money and efficiency. I thought about Emma at her friend's birthday party, probably eating cake and laughing without a care in the world. And I envied her that innocence with an intensity that surprised me. When gray dawn finally started seeping through the cabin windows, I got up stiff and unrested, fed the stove back to life, and tried to convince myself that the first night in an isolated cabin was always the hardest, that tonight would be easier once I got used to the solitude again. Then I found the deer carcass. It was 20 yards from the cabin, in a small clearing where Vernon used to park his old Ford before it finally gave up the ghost. A doe, maybe 8 months old, splayed open in a way that violated every natural predator pattern I'd ever seen. Bears tear into carcasses from the outside, ripping through hide and muscle to get at the meat and organs. Wolves and coyotes do the same, leaving puncture wounds from their teeth, scattered fur, signs of struggle. This deer looked like something had reached inside from the rib cage and pulled everything outward. Bones bent the wrong way, organs missing but not eaten on sight, and no tracks in the soft earth around it, except the deer's own hoof prints from when it had been alive. I stood there in the cold morning, my breath steaming, staring at something that didn't make sense according to any predator behavior I understood. The skin along my spine prickled with the same instinctive warning that had kept my ancestors alive when saber-toothed cats hunted the plains. The knowledge that something apex, something that killed not just for food but because it could, had been here, was perhaps still here. I should have left then, should have gotten in the truck, driven straight home, and let Uncle Vernon's cabin fall into whatever decay waited for it. But Dark Hollow men finished what they started, and I had 2 more days of work to do. And I wasn't going to let some weird animal kill and my own overactive imagination drive me away from responsibility. So I got the shovel from the truck bed and buried what was left of the doe, telling myself the whole time that I was being rational, that I was being sensible, that there was nothing in these woods that posed any real threat to a grown man who knew how to handle himself. I believed that right up until the second night when I saw the eyes. I spent the next morning trying to find rational explanations that would let me sleep through the following night. The eyes I'd seen were amber-colored, catching my flashlight beam like reflectors on a highway, but positioned 7 feet up in the darkness where no Wisconsin animal had any business being. I'd been standing on the porch, taking a piss around midnight, too lazy or too stubborn to walk out to the outhouse in the cold, when something made me sweep the flashlight beam toward the tree line. Just checking, just making sure. And there they were, perfectly still, perfectly level, watching me with an intensity that made my stream falter and my heart kick into a rhythm that felt like panic. I jerked the light away immediately, some primitive part of my brain screaming that making eye contact was submission or challenge or invitation. I didn't know which and didn't want to find out. When I forced myself to look again, they were gone. Not moving away, not retreating with the sound of brush being disturbed, just gone like they'd been swallowed by the darkness or had never existed at all. I'd gone back inside, latched the door, and spent the rest of the night sitting at Vernon's small table with the flashlight in one hand and a hunting knife in the other, watching the windows and telling myself I'd imagined it. But morning brought clarity of a sort, along with enough coffee to make my hands shake from more than just fear. I was a dairy farmer, not some city person who jumped at every shadow. I'd been in these woods hundreds of times. There had to be an explanation that didn't require me to abandon the work I'd come here to do. The most obvious answer was a bear. Black bears could stand on their hind legs, and while 7 feet was tall, it wasn't impossible for a large male. Maybe it had been closer to 6 feet, and the darkness had distorted my perception. Maybe the amber color was just how bear eyes reflected light under certain conditions. I'd always seen them reflect green or reddish in the past, but that didn't mean amber was impossible. Bears also explained the deer carcass, even if the method of killing was unusual. Maybe I'd simply never seen a bear feeding pattern like that before. There were probably dozens of bear behaviors I didn't know about despite growing up here. I spent an hour that morning walking the perimeter of the clearing, looking for bear sign. I found tracks, but they confused more than clarified. There were deer tracks, old ones from before the snow had come and melted and come again, their edges softened by weather. There were what might have been raccoon prints near the lake shore, but the prints near where I'd seen the eyes were wrong. Too large to be canine, wrong shape to be bear, and they seemed to show individual toe marks in a pattern that looked almost hand-like, which was impossible because nothing in Wisconsin had hands except humans and maybe raccoons, and these were far too big for raccoons. I took photos with the old digital camera I'd brought to document the cabin condition for insurance purposes, knowing even as I did it that the images wouldn't capture what bothered me about those prints. They just looked like unclear indentations in the soft earth, and anyone I showed them to would see what they expected to see. Bear, probably, or maybe dog. Around noon, I drove into Hayward needing supplies I didn't actually need, but really needing to be around other people, to hear normal conversation, to remind myself that the world was still the place I understood. Dale's hardware was warm and bright, country music playing from speakers mounted in the corners, and Dale himself was behind the counter sorting nails into small paper bags. "Cyrus, thought you'd be holed up at Vernon's place all week," he said, his broad face creasing into a smile. "Problems already?" "No, just needed a few things." I picked up a box of wood screws I had no use for, just to have something in my hands. "Dale, you been hearing anything about bear activity out past Spider Lake? Maybe reports of aggressive behavior?" His smile faded slightly, replaced by the concerned expression people get when they think you might be developing a problem. "Bears should be denning up by now. Why?" "Found a deer kill near the cabin. Looked fresh, maybe a day old. Torn up pretty bad." "Probably wolves. We got 3 packs ranging through that area now. DNR's been tracking them." He rang up my screws, gave me a price I didn't listen to. "They'll take down a deer, eat what they want, move on. Nothing to worry about unless you're planning to bring livestock up there." "Right. Wolves." I paid with cash, took my unnecessary purchase. The kill just looked strange is all, like something had reached inside the rib cage. Dale laughed, but it was the kind of laugh meant to ease tension. "You've been up there alone too long already. My advice? Get your work done and come on home. These old cabins, they got a way of making a man's imagination work overtime." My uncle had a place up near Gordon. He used to swear he heard things walking on the roof at night. Turned out it was pine cones dropping. I wanted to tell him the pine cones don't have eyes 7 feet off the ground, that they don't leave tracks that look almost human, that the silence in the forest around Vernon's cabin was the kind of silence that happens when every living thing is hiding from something at the top of the food chain. But I could see in his face that he'd already categorized my concern as isolation jitters, the kind of thing that happened to people who weren't used to spending time alone. So I thanked him, took my screws, and drove back to Spider Lake with the radio turned up loud, trying to fill the truck cab with enough noise to crowd out the memory of those amber eyes watching me from the darkness. The afternoon passed in productive work that felt like meditation. I drained the pipes, working through the process with the focus of someone who needed to think about something simple and solvable. Water gurgled and spat from the kitchen tap from the old pump that Vernon had insisted on keeping, despite the thing being older than I was. I checked each connection, made sure everything was clear, and tried not to think about nightfall coming earlier every day, about how the sun was already starting its descent by 4 o'clock. I made myself stay outside until the last possible moment, splitting firewood I didn't need just to have an excuse to be in the fading daylight. The rhythm of the axe was soothing, the bite of blade into wood producing clean splits that fell away in 2 neat pieces. Productive, understandable, the kind of cause and effect that made sense in a world I recognized. But I couldn't ignore the silence. The forest around me remained unnaturally quiet, devoid of the small rustlings and bird calls that should have been constant background noise. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving the pines motionless against the darkening sky. I found myself stopping between swings and listening for something I couldn't name, feeling watched in a way that raised every primitive alarm my DNA possessed. When I finally went inside and lit the kerosene lanterns, I felt simultaneously safer and more vulnerable. Safer because I had walls around me, however thin. More vulnerable because I'd made myself visible, a beacon of light and warmth in the darkness, advertising my presence to whatever was out there. I cooked dinner on the wood stove, canned beef stew that tasted like metal and salt, and ate it while standing at the window looking out at nothing. The second night I told myself I'd stay awake. I'd keep the fire burning bright, keep the flashlight handy, and I'd watch. If those eyes appeared again, I'd get a better look. I'd see what was really there. Prove to myself it was just a bear or a wolf or some completely ordinary animal that seemed strange, only because I was tired and isolated and letting my imagination work overtime. Just like Dale said, I made it until about 11 o'clock before my eyes started getting heavy. The warmth from the stove was too comfortable, the exhaustion from poor sleep the night before too complete. I let myself stretch out on Vernon's cot, telling myself I'd just rest for a minute, that I wouldn't actually sleep. I woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of something moving past the cabin. Not walking exactly. The footfalls were too measured, too deliberate. They came from the south side where the forest pressed close to the structure, and they were heavy enough that I could feel the vibration through the floorboards. One step, pause, another step, pause. Like whatever was out there was testing the ground with each placement of its feet, or perhaps listening between each movement. I lay frozen on the cot. My breath caught somewhere in my chest. my heart hammering so hard. I was certain it could be heard outside. The steps continued past the window, and I watched the darkness beyond the glass, praying I wouldn't see movement, praying equally hard that if I did see something, it would be explainable. The steps stopped directly outside the door. I could hear breathing then, or something like breathing, deep and measured, with a wet quality that made me think of the sounds the Holsteins made when they had respiratory infections. But this was louder, more conscious somehow, as if the thing outside was deliberately making itself heard. My hand found the flashlight on the floor beside the cot. I gripped it, feeling the solid weight of it, and tried to decide if illumination would help or harm me. The rational part of my brain, the part that had spent 34 years believing the world operated according to understandable rules, insisted that I needed to see what was really there. That mystery was worse than reality, that nothing in Wisconsin could actually hurt a grown man who kept his head. The breathing outside changed, becoming something almost like sniffing around, like the thing was sampling the air, learning what was inside by scent. I thought about my own smell, sweat and wood smoke, and the beef stew I'd eaten for dinner, and wondered what information those scents conveyed to whatever was outside. Then it moved on. The heavy footfalls resumed, continuing around the cabin to the lakeside, and I heard the creak of boards on the small dock Vernon had built decades ago. Something was walking on the dock, testing the wood with its weight, and then I heard the sound of it descending to the rocky shore. I made myself get up, made myself move to the window, even though every survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to stay still, stay quiet, stay invisible. The moon was nearly full that night, its light turning the lake surface into a mirror of silver and black, and in that light I could see it. The silhouette stood at the water's edge, massive against the reflection. I couldn't make out details from this distance, but I could see the shape. Bipedal, standing upright on two legs the way a human would, but too large, shoulders too broad. The head wrong somehow, even in outline. It stood perfectly still facing the lake, and I had the insane impression it was looking at something out on the water, or perhaps listening to something I couldn't hear. 8 feet tall, maybe more. The perspective was hard to judge in moonlight and through the distortion of old window glass, but it was bigger than any bear had a right to be. Bigger than seemed possible for anything that walked on 2 legs. Its arms hung at its sides, too long in proportion to the torso, reaching down past where human arms would end. I stood at that window for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, watching the thing stand motionless at the shore, my mind trying desperately to fit what I was seeing into categories that made sense. A person maybe, someone in a costume, someone trying to scare me, but who and why? And how did that explain the deer carcass, the tracks, the eyes 7 feet up in the tree line? A bear standing upright. That had to be it. Black bears could walk on their hind legs for short distances. Maybe this one had some kind of deformity that made it more comfortable being bipedal, some genetic quirk that the thing moved, and any remaining hope of rational explanation died in my chest. It didn't move like a bear. Bears are lumbering, awkward on 2 legs, constantly seeking to return to 4. This thing moved with purpose and balance, striding along the shore with an easy gait and spoke of a body designed for exactly this kind of locomotion. It walked like it owned this lake, this forest, this entire stretch of territory that I'd been stupid enough to think was mine by inheritance and deed. I watched it disappear into the tree line on the far side of the clearing, moving with a silence that something that size shouldn't possess. The forest swallowed it, and I was left standing at the window in my socks and thermal underwear, gripping a flashlight hard enough to make my knuckles ache, trying to convince myself that I hadn't just seen what I'd seen. Maybe it was the angle. Maybe the moonlight had distorted things, thrown shadows that created an impression of size where none really existed. Maybe I was more tired than I thought, my mind playing tricks after 2 nights of poor sleep and isolation. Maybe Dale was right about old cabins making a man's imagination work overtime. I told myself all of these things as I wedged the small table against the door, as I checked the windows to make sure they were latched, as I fed more wood into the stove even though the cabin was already warm enough to make me sweat. I told myself these things as I sat back down on Vernon's cot with the flashlight in my lap and the hunting knife beside me, watching the windows and listening to the silence and waiting for dawn to come. But I didn't believe any of it. Something was out there in the woods around Spider Lake. Something that walked upright and watched the cabin with amber eyes and moved through the forest, like it had been doing so for longer than the cabin had existed, longer than the Dark Hollow family had owned this land, longer than the town of Hayward had been anything more than a trading post, serving lumberjacks and trappers. And whatever it was, it knew I was here, had taken my measure, and found me wanting, or perhaps found me acceptable in some way I didn't want to contemplate. The thought made me nauseous with fear and something else, a kind of existential dread at realizing the world contained things outside the taxonomy I'd been taught, things that rendered my 34 years of accumulated knowledge insufficient. When gray dawn finally came, I was still sitting on that cot, still gripping the flashlight, still trying to convince myself that what I'd seen had some explanation that didn't require me to accept that everything I knew about Wisconsin wildlife was incomplete at best, dangerously wrong at worst. I had 1 day of work left, one more night before I could leave with the job done, with my conscience clear and my promise kept. One more night of whatever was out there, deciding whether to leave me alone or... I didn't let myself finish that thought. I spent that third morning doing exactly what I'd planned to do the previous day, draining pipes, checking the roof seams for damage, hauling Vernon's old newspapers and magazines into a pile for burning. The work gave me something to focus on besides the growing conviction that I was losing my mind, or worse, that I wasn't losing my mind at all. The mundane tasks felt like defiance, like refusing to acknowledge that my understanding of reality had been fundamentally compromised. I told myself that daylight made everything different, that whatever I'd seen in the darkness couldn't possibly exist in the rational world of plumbing and roof repairs. The sun was out, weak November sunshine, filtering through the pine canopy, and in that light I could almost convince myself that fear and isolation had manufactured the impossible. Almost. The tracks were still there when I went out to check the woodpile. Fresh ones from some time after dawn. I'd been inside for maybe an hour working on the sink drain, and in that time something had circled the cabin, pressing through the frost-stiffened grass, leaving prints that measured 14 inches long and showed 5 distinct toe impressions, each ending in what could only be described as a claw mark. I crouched beside one of the clearest prints, my breath fogging in the cold air, and tried to make it fit any pattern I knew. Bare tracks showed 5 toes, but included distinct pad marks. These didn't. Wolf tracks were elongated and showed 4 toes. These showed 5. Dog prints were smaller and differently proportioned. These were massive, with a shape that suggested something that walked primarily upright. The weight distribution all wrong for a quadruped. The toe arrangement looked almost like fingers. Not quite human, but closer to human than anything that should be walking through Vernon's property on what appeared to be 2 legs. I pulled out my phone and took pictures. The rational part of my brain still insisting that documentation mattered, that evidence was important, even if I couldn't explain what the evidence actually documented. The photos looked exactly like the tracks did in person. Impossible, threatening, undeniably real. When I stood up, I saw the marks on the cabin's north wall. They were scratch marks, gouged deep into the weathered logs about 6 feet off the ground. 4 parallel furrows, each one maybe 18 inches long, carved through the wood grain like something had tested the structural integrity and found it wanting. The marks were fresh. I could see pale wood exposed where the bark had been torn away, sap still weeping from the deepest gouges. I walked slowly along the cabin's perimeter, my chest tight with the kind of dread that comes from confirming your worst suspicions. More marks on the east wall, near the window of the main room, scratches on the corner posts where they met the roof overhang. And on the west wall near the door, something that made my stomach drop. Handprints. They were pressed into the thin layer of frost that still clung to the shaded side of the cabin. 5-fingered impressions that measured nearly a foot across. The fingers were too long, the palm too broad, the overall shape wrong in ways that my brain struggled to process. But the most disturbing detail was the thumbs. Opposable, positioned exactly as they would be on a human hand, suggesting a level of dexterity that made every hair on my neck stand up. This thing had hands. Actual functional hands that could grip, manipulate, open doors and windows if it wanted to. The implications of that made my knees weak. I spent the next hour checking every possible entry point. The windows all had old-fashioned latches, the kind that could be jimmied open with a knife blade if you knew what you were doing. The door had a simple hook-and-eye lock that wouldn't stop a determined child, let alone something with the apparent strength to gouge wood like it was soft cheese. The cabin suddenly felt less like shelter and more like a trap. 4 walls that gave me the illusion of safety, while actually just limiting my options for escape. The practical work I'd been doing all morning felt pointless now. What did it matter if the pipes were winterized, if the cabin itself was compromised? What was I protecting by sealing the windows when the thing outside could apparently tear through the walls if it decided to? But I kept working anyway because stopping meant acknowledging that I was genuinely afraid, that I was in actual danger, that the situation had progressed beyond uncomfortable into something approaching dire. I went back inside and finished draining the water heater, then started covering the furniture with the old sheets Vernon had kept in the closet. My hands were shaking badly enough that I had trouble tucking the fabric in, and I kept looking at the windows, expecting to see amber eyes staring back at me. Around noon, I made coffee on the wood stove and ate a can of soup cold because I couldn't focus enough to heat it properly. The cabin felt simultaneously too small and too exposed. Small enough that I could hear every settling creak and weather-induced groan. Exposed enough that I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. I kept the hunting knife on the table beside me within easy reach even though I had no illusions about what good 6 inches of steel would do against something that could tear through a deer carcass like tissue paper. The rational explanations I'd been clinging to were falling away one by one, leaving me with a reality I didn't want to accept. This wasn't a bear with unusual behavior patterns. This wasn't a pack of wolves operating outside their normal parameters. This wasn't someone in a costume trying to scare me off the property. This was something else entirely. Something that walked upright and left human-like handprints and moved through the forest with predatory grace. Something that had been watching me since I arrived, taking my measure, deciding what to do about the man who'd moved into its territory without permission or understanding. The thought kept circling back. It knew I was here. Had known from the moment I'd parked the truck and unloaded my supplies. The silences I'd noticed weren't just unusual animal behavior. They were the forest responding to an apex predator. Every creature with survival instincts, recognizing the presence of something that sat at the top of a food chain I hadn't known existed. And that thing, whatever it was, had spent the last 2 nights observing me, learning my patterns, testing the cabin's defenses, leaving increasingly bold signs of its presence, like it was trying to communicate something. A warning, perhaps, or an assertion of territory, or possibly just curiosity about what I would do. I thought about leaving right then, abandoning the last few tasks, and just getting the hell out while I still could. But it was only early afternoon, and I'd promised myself I'd finish the job. More than that, some stubborn part of me refused to be run off by something I didn't understand. The Dark Hollow men finished what they started, even if it meant facing down the impossible. The rationalization felt thin even as I made it. The truth was I was afraid that running would trigger something, that fleeing like prey would flip some switch in the thing's brain and turn observation into pursuit. Better to finish the work, leave at dawn as planned, maintain the illusion that I belonged here and had every right to do what I was doing. The afternoon dragged by in a haze of paranoid vigilance. Every sound made me flinch. Branches scraping against the roof, ice creaking on the lake, the wind picking up and moaning through the eaves. I kept checking the windows, kept glancing at the door, kept my hand near the knife and my body tensed for action I hoped wouldn't come. Around 4 o'clock, when the light was starting to fail and the temperature was dropping toward what would be a bitterly cold night, I went out to bring in more firewood. I'd been putting it off, not wanting to leave the cabin's dubious safety, but the stove burned through wood fast and I needed enough to last until morning. The wood pile was on the south side of the cabin, maybe 20 yards into the clearing, stacked against a lean-to Vernon had built decades ago. I approached it slowly, scanning the tree line, every sense on high alert. The forest was quiet again. That oppressive silence that I now understood meant something was nearby, something that made even the ravens and squirrels hide. I was reaching for a log when I smelled it. The scent hit me like a physical thing. Musk and copper and something else, something wild and old and wrong. It was the smell of predator, the smell that triggered every survival instinct hardwired into my primate brain. The smell that said run, hide, do anything but stay here. I froze with my hand on the wood, my body locked in place by competing impulses. Grab the logs and retreat to the cabin, or don't make any sudden moves that might trigger an attack response. The smell was strong, close, like whatever was producing it was within yards, rather than tens of yards. I turned slowly, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, and I saw it standing at the edge of the clearing, maybe 30 feet away. In the failing light, I could finally see details that the darkness and distance had previously hidden. The snout was long and powerful, somewhere between German Shepherd and Timber Wolf, but broader through the jaw, with visible teeth, even though its mouth was closed. Canines that overlapped the lips, yellowed and thick as my fingers. The head was massive, sitting on shoulders that were grotesquely wide, easily 3 feet across, corded with muscle under fur that looked coarse and dark, almost black, where the shadows hid it. But it was the hands that destroyed any remaining hope of misidentification. They hung at its sides, clearly visible, and they were hands in every functional sense. 5 fingers ending in curved black claws, thumbs positioned for gripping and manipulation. The whole structure suggesting dexterity and purpose. One hand flexed as I watched, the fingers spreading and then curling, as if it was testing its grip or perhaps demonstrating what those claws could do. The fur on the arms looked thicker than on the hands, covering what appeared to be muscle structure more human than canine. The forearms suggested strength that would snap my spine like kindling. But the proportions, the way the joints articulated, the way it held its arms slightly away from its body, it was all wrong for any animal I'd ever seen or studied. I stood there, holding a piece of firewood in one hand, staring at something that shouldn't exist, and the thing stared back with those amber eyes that reflected the dying light like mirrors. The intelligence in those eyes was unmistakable. This wasn't an animal operating on instinct alone. This was something that thought, planned, understood causality and consequence. We looked at each other across 30 feet of frozen grass, and I realized with perfect clarity that it had let me see it. This wasn't an accidental encounter or a careless reveal. This was deliberate. It wanted me to see it fully, wanted me to understand exactly what had been circling the cabin, what had been studying me, what had been leaving tracks and scratch marks and handprints. It wanted me to know what I was dealing with. The moment stretched out, seconds that felt like hours, my breath coming in shallow gasps that fogged the air between us. Some part of my brain was screaming at me to run, to get back to the cabin, to put walls and doors between myself and this thing, even though I now understood how inadequate those barriers were. But I didn't move, couldn't move. My body had locked up completely, every muscle frozen by fear so profound it bypassed conscious thought and went straight to the primitive hindbrain that understood, at a level beyond language, that I was in the presence of something that could kill me as easily as I'd killed mosquitoes on the drive up. Then it took a step toward me, not a rush or a charge, just one deliberate step that closed the distance by maybe 3 feet. The movement was fluid, balanced, the gait of something perfectly adapted to bipedal locomotion. It stood maybe 8 feet tall, I realized. I was watching it move, and my brain was automatically calculating proportions, trying to make sense of what I was seeing by translating it into familiar measurements. 8 feet tall, probably 400 pounds or more, all of it muscle and bone and tearing power, hands that could grip, intelligence that could strategize. And it had just taken a step toward me. I took a step back, my body finally responding to the screaming signals from my brain. The thing's head tilted slightly, watching me retreat, and I swear I saw something in its expression. Not quite amusement, not quite curiosity, but something that suggested it found my response interesting, noteworthy, perhaps even expected. Another step back and another, and I was calculating the distance to the cabin door, knowing I couldn't outrun this thing if it decided to chase me, but unable to stop myself from trying anyway. The piece of firewood was still clutched in my hand, a laughably inadequate weapon, but the only thing I had besides the knife. Back inside. The creature took another step forward, maintaining the distance between us, and I realized what was happening. It was herding me, driving me back toward the cabin. Not attacking, not yet, just pushing me where it wanted me to go, demonstrating in the clearest possible way that I was not in control here, had never been in control, had been operating under its sufferance since I'd arrived. My back hit the cabin wall harder than I'd intended, and I fumbled for the door handle without taking my eyes off the thing in the clearing. It had stopped advancing, standing now maybe 20 feet away, close enough that I could see the rise and fall of its chest as it breathed, close enough that I could see the individual hairs of its fur moving in the wind, close enough that if it decided to close the distance, there would be nothing I could do to stop it. I got the door open and stumbled inside, slamming it shut and throwing the hook lock, even though I knew how useless it was. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely work the latch. And when I finally got it secured, I backed away from the door till I hit the far wall, my eyes fixed on the wood like I could see through it. The firewood. I'd left most of the firewood outside. I dropped the piece I was holding somewhere between the woodpile and the cabin, and now I had maybe enough to last until midnight if I was careful. After that, I'd either freeze or have to go back outside for more, and going back outside meant I couldn't finish the thought. I stood there in the growing darkness of the cabin, listening to my own ragged breathing, trying to process what I'd just seen. Every detail was burned into my memory with perfect clarity: the snout, the hands, the eyes, the way it moved with terrible purpose and intelligence. This wasn't something that could be explained away or rationalized into comfortable categories. This was real, it was here, and it had just shown me exactly what it was capable of doing. The isolation hit me then with full force. 40 miles from Hayward, no cell service, the nearest neighbor probably 5 miles through the woods. The landline only worked if the phone company's ancient equipment decided to cooperate. I'd tried it earlier that day, gotten nothing but dead air. Nobody knew where I was or when to expect me back. If something happened to me out here, it might be weeks before anyone thought to check. I was alone with this thing, and it knew it. As full darkness fell, I fed the last piece of wood into the stove and watched the flames catch, knowing that when this burned down, I'd have a choice to make: freeze in relative safety or risk going outside again. Neither option seemed survivable. Neither option seemed like anything a rational person should have to consider. But I wasn't in a rational situation anymore. I was in something else entirely. Something that Vernon hadn't warned me about. Something that 40 years of accumulated family wisdom hadn't prepared me for. I was in the territory of something that walked like a man and hunted like a wolf and watched with intelligence that suggested it understood exactly what I was and what I meant to its domain. And I had one more night to survive before I could leave. The fire in the stove was dying, and the temperature in the cabin had already dropped enough that I could see my breath misting in the dim light. I'd been standing against the far wall for maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. Time had stopped meaning anything coherent, and my legs were starting to cramp. From the tension of holding myself rigid, ready for movement I wasn't sure I'd be capable of executing. The wood situation was critical. I had nothing left to burn except the chair I was leaning against, and maybe the small bookshelf Vernon had built into the corner, and even that would only buy me a few hours. After that, hypothermia would do what the creature outside might not bother finishing. I forced myself to move, to cross to the window, and look out at the clearing. The moonlight was bright enough now that I could see the whole area in shades of silver and black, every tree trunk casting its own shadow, every stump and rock visible in sharp relief. It was still there. The creature stood in the exact center of the clearing, perfectly motionless, facing the cabin, just standing there like a man might stand waiting for a bus, casual and patient and utterly wrong in ways that made my hindbrain scream. The posture was too relaxed, too controlled. It wasn't hunting anymore, it was waiting. For what? For me to run out of fire? For me to panic and bolt? For dawn when it could see me better? I watched it for 5 minutes, 10, and it didn't move at all except for the slow rise and fall of breathing. The fur along its shoulders and back seemed to absorb the moonlight, creating a zone of darkness that was deeper than the shadows around it. The snout was angled slightly downward like it was lost in thought, but I could see the ears, pointed, mobile, constantly adjusting to track sounds I couldn't hear. It was listening to everything. The cabin settling, my breathing, my heartbeat probably. The fire popped behind me, a log collapsing into coals, and the creature's head came up instantly, those amber eyes fixing on the window where I stood. I jerked back from the glass but knew it was too late. It had seen me watching. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then it moved. Not toward the cabin, sideways, circling, keeping the same distance but changing its angle of approach. The movement was utterly silent despite its size, despite the frost-hardened ground that should have crunched under that weight. It moved like smoke, like thought, repositioning itself so that it stood between me and the truck. The message was clear. The truck wasn't an option anymore. Whatever was going to happen next, I wouldn't be driving away from it. I backed away from the window and tried to think, really think, past the panic that was making my thoughts slide off each other like oil on water. The cabin had 2 rooms, the main room where I was standing, and Vernon's small bedroom with the cot and the cedar chest full of his hunting clothes. 1 door to the outside, windows on 3 walls, none of them large enough to squeeze through even if I broke them. The outhouse was 15 yards away through the clearing, completely exposed. The woodpile was 20 yards in the opposite direction. I was trapped, essentially. Trapped in a structure that wouldn't hold against determined assault, with a fire that was dying, and no way to replenish it without going outside, where that thing waited. The rational part of my brain, the part that had gotten me through 34 years of farm work and machinery accidents and 1 bad car crash when I was 19, tried to assert itself. I needed a plan. I needed options. I needed to think of this as a problem with solutions, rather than a nightmare with no exit. But the other part of my brain, the older part, the part that remembered what it was like to be prey, was screaming that there were no solutions here. That thing outside was an apex predator in its element, and I was livestock that had wandered too far from the barn. The fire was almost out now. Just embers glowing in the stove. Barely enough heat to matter. I grabbed the chair I'd been leaning against and started breaking it apart, legs first, trying to be quiet about it. but knowing the creature could hear every crack of wood, every grunt of effort. I fed the legs into the stove one at a time, building the fire back up just enough to push back the darkness and cold. It bought me time. Maybe an hour. Maybe 2 if I burned the rest of the chair and started on the bookshelf. But then what? Eventually I'd run out of furniture, and eventually dawn would come, or it wouldn't, and I'd have to make a choice. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall where I could see both the door and the window, the kitchen knife from earlier in my right hand, and tried to remember every story Vernon had ever told me about these woods. He'd hunted here for 40 years, trapped fur in the winters, fished the lake every summer. If there was something like this out here, something that walked on 2 legs and thought with human cunning, wouldn't he have mentioned it? Wouldn't there have been some warning, some hint that I was inheriting more than just property? But then I remembered the way Vernon had changed in his last years. How he'd stopped coming up here alone, always bringing Dale or one of his other hunting buddies. How he'd sold off most of his traps and started talking about retiring from the woods entirely, maybe buying a little place in town. I'd thought it was just age catching up with him, the body not willing to handle the isolation and physical demands anymore. Now I wondered if he'd seen something, if he'd had his own encounter with whatever was out there, and decided the smart thing was to retreat gracefully while he still could. If so, he'd never told me, never warned me, and now I was here, sitting in his cabin, waiting for something to happen that I couldn't prevent and couldn't escape. The fire consumed the chair legs and started on the seat. The warmth felt good, necessary, but I knew it was temporary. Everything was temporary now. Every moment of safety was just borrowed time until the thing outside decided to stop waiting. At midnight, I checked Vernon's old wind-up clock on the mantel. The creature moved again. This time it came closer, crossing half the distance to the cabin in smooth, silent strides that covered ground faster than should have been possible. It stopped maybe 10 feet from the door, and I heard it for the first time since the initial encounter. It made a sound low in its chest, not quite a growl, not quite a vocalization, but something that carried meaning even without words. The sound rolled through the cabin walls, resonated in my rib cage, made my hands grip the knife tighter even though I knew how useless it would be. Then it spoke. Not words, exactly, not language, but a sound that was shaped, modulated, formed by a throat that understood the concept of speech, even if it chose not to use it for communication. The sound rose and fell in a pattern that felt like a question, like it was testing something, measuring my response. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The creature made the sound again, slightly different this time, and I realized with sick certainty that it was learning, experimenting, trying out vocalizations to see what effect they had. It was playing with me. The sound stopped, and in the silence that followed I heard something worse, the creak of the porch boards as weight shifted across them. It was on the porch now, right outside the door. The only barrier between us was Vernon's old plank door with its simple hook latch, the kind of thing that was meant to keep out wind and maybe raccoons. Nothing more substantial than that. I stood up, knife in hand, and backed toward the bedroom. If it came through the door, I wanted the extra few seconds of distance, the extra barrier of the bedroom doorway, anything that might buy me one more moment to think or act or pray. The doorknob rattled. An experimental sound, metal turning in its socket, testing the mechanism. Then silence again, and I realized the creature was examining the door, understanding how it worked, considering its options. The hook latch clicked. Not broken, unhooked. The creature had worked the latch free from outside, probably sliding a claw through the gap between door and frame, manipulating the hook until it lifted clear. The door swung open slowly and cold air rushed in. And there in the doorway stood the thing I'd been hiding from. Full view. Complete view. Every detail illuminated by the fire behind me and the moon behind it. 8 feet tall, easy. Shoulders broader than any man's. Powerful and sloped forward slightly like a bear's, but with definition that suggested human musculature underneath. The torso was barrel-chested, covered in dark fur that was shorter on the chest and belly, longer on the shoulders and back. The arms were long, proportioned wrong for a human, hanging lower than they should, ending in hands that were definitely hands. 5 fingers, opposable thumb, but tipped with black claws that curved to wicked points. The legs were digitigrade, bent backward at what would be the knee on a human, giving it that animal spring and power, but adapted for upright walking. The feet were massive, the toes spread wide for balance, clawed like the hands. But it was the head that froze me completely. The snout was long and broad, filled with teeth I could see even with its mouth closed, teeth designed for tearing meat and crushing bone. The ears were pointed, mobile, tracking every tiny sound. The eyes were amber, reflective, set forward in the skull for binocular vision, predator's eyes. And they held an intelligence that was absolutely, terrifyingly human in its depth and awareness. This wasn't an animal, wasn't a man. Was something else entirely, something that occupied a space between categories that shouldn't exist but did, had always existed, was probably here long before Vernon's grandfather cleared these woods, would be here long after the cabin rotted away. It stood in the doorway and looked at me, and I saw recognition in those eyes. Not just of me as prey, but of me as something it understood. Another thinking being, another consciousness. It knew what I was, knew what fear looked like, knew exactly what it was doing to me just by standing there. Then it took a step inside. The knife felt like a toothpick in my hand. The bedroom doorway behind me felt miles away instead of feet. Every survival instinct I had was screaming conflicting instructions. Run, fight, freeze, submit, attack, flee, until the noise canceled itself out and I just stood there, stupid and paralyzed, watching the thing advance. It took another step and another, moving slowly like it had all the time in the world. Maybe it did. Maybe I'd already used up my borrowed time, and this was just the closing of a transaction that started the moment I arrived at Vernon's cabin. The fire popped loudly in the stove, a log shifting, and the creature's head turned toward the sound for just a second, attention diverted, and something in me broke loose from the paralysis. I moved without thinking, without planning, driven by pure panic instinct. The kerosene lantern was on the table 3 feet to my left, Vernon's old hurricane lamp that I'd filled yesterday for emergencies. I grabbed it in my left hand, the knife still in my right, and hurled the lantern straight at the creature's chest. Glass shattered. Kerosene splashed across fur and the floor. The creature stepped back, not panicked, but definitely surprised. And I was already moving, grabbing the poker from beside the stove, using it to scrape burning coals out of the firebox, scooping them toward the kerosene spreading across the floor. The ignition was instant. Flames rolled across the floor in a blue-orange wave. caught the creature's legs and torso, spread up across fur that must have been coated in oils because it went up like it was designed to burn. The creature bellowed, the first truly animal sound I'd heard from it, and lurched backward, away from the flames, colliding with the doorframe. The fire clung to its fur, spreading, and it reacted with something that looked like recognition, like it knew what fire meant, what fire could do, like maybe it had encountered fire before and survived but learned a lesson. It turned and crashed through the doorway, moving fast now, all grace abandoned in the favor of escape, and I heard it hit the ground outside, heard the thrashing as it rolled to smother the flames, heard a sound that might have been rage or pain or both. I didn't wait to analyze. Behind me, the fire was spreading from the kerosene across the dry floorboards, starting to catch on Vernon's old curtains. The cabin was going up. The truck keys were hanging on a nail by the door. I grabbed them, grabbed my coat, and ran. Outside, the clearing was chaos. The creature was on its side 20 feet away, still rolling. Most of the fire out, but smoke rising from scorched fur. Between me and the truck was open ground, 30 yards of frost-covered clearing where I'd be completely exposed. I ran anyway, boots pounding frozen earth, breath tearing in my lungs, the truck looming closer with impossible slowness. Behind me, I heard the creature getting to its feet, heard a sound that was definitely rage this time. But I was at the truck, fumbling the keys, dropping them, snatching them up with shaking hands that barely worked. The door opened. I threw myself inside. The key found the ignition on the second try, and the engine caught with a roar that was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. Movement in the rearview mirror. The creature was up, moving toward me, fast now, covering ground with long, loping strides that ate distance like it meant nothing. I slammed the truck into reverse and floored it, tires spinning on frost, before finding traction, sending me backward down the 2-track in a screaming cloud of exhaust and panic. In the rear view, I caught a glimpse of flames flickering through the cabin windows. Vernon's place was burning, and I didn't care. Trees whipped past on both sides, branches scraping metal, and I didn't brake, didn't slow, just kept my foot down and watched the rear view for the shape pursuing me. It was there for maybe 100 yards, keeping pace with the truck, close enough that I could see the amber eyes in the reflected taillights. Then it stopped, just stopped running and stood in the middle of the track, watching me go. And I knew with absolute certainty that it had let me escape, that it could have caught me if it wanted, could have stopped the truck, stopped me, but chose not to. It had made its point, demonstrated its superiority, shown me exactly what lived in these woods and what I meant to it. I hit the county road doing 40 in reverse and nearly flipped the truck making the turn, but I got the vehicle pointed forward and drove. Drove without headlights because turning them on would mean stopping long enough to work the switch, and my hands wouldn't leave the steering wheel. Drove through the darkness, following the pale strip of gravel by moonlight, driving by memory and instinct and blind luck. 40 miles to Hayward. I made it in 35 minutes, running every stop sign, taking corners too fast, not caring about anything except distance between me and that clearing. The sheriff's office was on Main Street, a small brick building with a parking lot that was empty at 4 in the morning when I finally pulled in. I sat in the truck with the engine running, hands locked on the wheel, trying to remember how to breathe normally, how to think, like someone who lived in civilization again instead of someone who'd just escaped from a nightmare. The fluorescent lights inside the office were steady and institutional and safe. I could see a deputy at a desk, probably doing paperwork on the overnight shift. All I had to do was walk inside and tell him what happened. Tell him there was something in the woods at Spider Lake. Tell him about Vernon's cabin, about the fire I'd started, about the creature that stood 8 feet tall and had hands and intelligence and had let me live for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. I sat there until sunrise, trying to form the words, trying to imagine the conversation. It never came together right. Every version sounded like insanity or drugs or a breakdown. Every version ended with questions I couldn't answer and explanations I didn't have. Every version meant people looking at me differently, treating me differently, wondering if Cyrus Darkhollow had finally cracked under the pressure of keeping the farm going and Vernon dying and all the accumulated weight of being the last of the line. Rachel answered the phone on the 3rd ring, her voice thick with sleep. "Cyrus, what time is it?" "I'm coming home," I said. "I'm in Hayward. I'm coming home now." "Did you finish the cabin?" "No, I'm selling it. I'm selling the property, the whole thing. I don't care about the money. I just need to sell it and be done with it." A pause. "Are you okay? You sound..." "I'm fine. I just need to come home. I'll be there by lunch." I hung up before she could ask anything else, before I'd have to decide whether to tell her the truth or construct a lie that would serve for the rest of our marriage. The drive back to the farm took 3 hours. I spent them trying to process what had happened, trying to fit it into a framework that made sense. But the pieces wouldn't align. The creature was real. I'd seen it, fought it, escaped it. But what was it? Where did it come from? Why was it there? I had no answers. Just the memory of amber eyes and the sound of burning fur and the knowledge that something existed in those woods that wasn't supposed to exist, that violated every natural law I understood, and that I'd been lucky enough to survive an encounter that could have ended very differently. Rachel was waiting in the driveway when I pulled up. I saw her face register the state I was in. Still wearing yesterday's clothes, hands shaking, eyes probably wild. And she came down to meet me before I'd even turned off the engine. "What happened?" "Nothing, I just want to come inside." "Cyrus, please, I just want to come inside and be home. Can we do that?" She studied me for a long moment, then nodded. We went inside together and I locked the door behind us, checking the lock twice to be sure it was secure, even though I knew locks wouldn't matter, wouldn't have mattered at the cabin, wouldn't matter here if that thing ever decided to come looking, but it wouldn't come looking. Some part of me knew that with the same certainty I knew the sun would rise. The creature existed in those woods because those were its woods, its territory, its domain. I'd been the intruder, and it had expelled me with just enough force to make sure I understood the terms. I didn't go back to Spider Lake, didn't try to salvage anything from the cabin or check on the property. I called a realtor in Hayward the next day and told them to list it as is, sell it to whoever would take it. I didn't care about the price. The property sold in 3 weeks to a developer from Minneapolis who wanted to build vacation homes on the lakefront. I signed the papers at the bank without reading them, took the check, deposited it into the farm account, and tried to forget the whole thing had ever happened. But forgetting wasn't possible. The memory was too clear, too visceral, too completely world-changing. I kept farming through the rest of that winter and into spring, doing the milking and the maintenance and the endless cycle of work that had defined my life since I was old enough to hold a wrench. but the isolation that had never bothered me before. The long days alone with the herd, the nights with just Rachel and Emma, the solitude of the Wisconsin countryside, had become unbearable. I found myself checking the tree line constantly, looking for movement that wasn't there. Started sleeping with the lights on until Rachel asked me what was wrong, and I told her I'd been having bad dreams, which was true but incomplete. The bad dreams were memories, and the memories were real. By summer, I knew I couldn't stay. The farm that had been in our family for 3 generations felt like a trap, isolated and exposed, too far from other people, too close to woods that might contain things I didn't want to think about. I sold it in September to a corporate dairy operation that planned to expand the herd and modernize the infrastructure. The money was good, better than good, enough that Rachel and I could afford a real house in Eau Claire with neighbors on both sides and streetlights that stayed on all night. Emma cried when we told her we were moving. She'd grown up on the farm, knew every corner of it, had that child's attachment to place that adults lose somewhere along the way. But we moved anyway, and I took a job as assistant manager at a farm and fleet in town, helping people pick out equipment and feed, using everything Vernon and my father and grandfather had taught me, but in a context that felt safe, contained, supervised. Rachel adapted. She always adapted, found new routines, made new friends, enrolled Emma in a school where she wouldn't have to ride the bus for 40 minutes each way. But I saw her watching me sometimes, when she thought I wasn't looking, and I knew she was trying to understand what had changed, what had broken in me that made the life we'd had together impossible to continue. I wanted to tell her, came close 12 times, sitting at the kitchen table or lying in bed at night, the words forming in my throat before dying there, because I knew how they'd sound. Crazy, paranoid, like someone who'd snapped under pressure and constructed a fantasy to justify running away from responsibility. Better to let her think I'd gotten soft, gone suburban, given up on the family legacy for comfort and convenience. Better to let her be quietly disappointed than terrified. Emma's 13 now, 3 years after we moved. She's made friends at school, joined soccer, mostly stopped asking when we're going back to the farm. She thinks Daddy just got scared of the woods like a little kid. And I let her believe it because the truth would be worse. I work my shifts at the farm and fleet, recommend feed ratios and explain tractor maintenance. Go home to the house where I can see 4 different neighbors from the kitchen window. The subdivision is everything I never thought I'd want. Houses close together, noise from the highway, streetlights that turn the night sky orange instead of black, and it's exactly what I need. Most days I'm fine. I help customers, eat dinner with Rachel and Emma, watch TV before bed, sleep through the night without incident. I've become almost normal again, almost the person I was before Vernon died and left me that cabin and that property and whatever lived in the woods around it. But some nights I wake up at 3 a.m., that hour when the creature stood in the clearing, and I have to check every lock in the house. Front door, back door, windows, basement door that leads to the outside, everything. Rachel stopped asking about it, stopped waking up when I leave the bed to make my rounds. The locks wouldn't matter. I know that. If that thing decided to come for me, decided I'd violated some rule I didn't understand, or broken some agreement I didn't know I'd made, the locks wouldn't slow it down for a second. But I check them anyway, because it's the only thing I can control. On those nights when sleep won't come back, I sit in the living room with every light on and scroll through Wisconsin cryptid forums on my phone. There are hundreds of them. People reporting strange encounters, unusual sightings, things in the woods that shouldn't exist. Most of it's obviously fake, attention-seeking nonsense designed to get views and comments. But some of it has a ring of truth, a specificity of detail and emotion that sounds like my own memories. I never post, never add my own story to the collection. What would be the point? The people who'd believe me would be the ones who'd already had their own encounters, who already knew what was out there. The people who wouldn't believe, couldn't believe, shouldn't believe because ignorance was the only thing protecting their sanity. But I read the stories and I recognized the pattern, the isolation, the silence, the progression from normal to wrong to nightmare. The survival and escape and aftermath that changes everything. And I wonder how many other people are out there like me, living in subdivision houses with good locks, carrying knowledge they can't share and memories they can't escape, waiting for the night it decides to come back. Because that's the thing they don't tell you about surviving an encounter with something that shouldn't exist. Survival isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning of a different story, one where you're never quite sure the encounter is really over, never quite certain you weren't followed, never quite able to relax into the comfortable assumption that the world is safe and sensible and governed by rules you understand. I survived. I'm alive. I have a job and a family and a house in Eau Claire, where nothing more dangerous than raccoons gets into the garbage. By every practical measure, I'm fine. But I remember the amber eyes and the intelligence behind them. And I know that somewhere out in the Wisconsin North Woods, 40 miles past Hayward in the deep wilderness around Spider Lake, there's something walking on two legs that let me live for reasons I'll never understand. And every 3 a.m., when I'm checking the locks again, I'm waiting for the night it changes its mind.